What if the face a queen showed the world was just a mask? What if the stoic ruler was secretly terrified or the frivolous party girl was a political mastermind? Could the Queen of Morning have been full of laughter behind closed doors? Was the Virgin Queen really so alone? History gives us portraits, statues, and official records. But letters, diaries, and the accounts of servants tell a different story. They show us the person, not the symbol. And often, that person was the complete opposite of the image they so carefully built. Number 20 was the Queen of Morning secretly full of life. Queen Victoria proposed to her husband, Prince Albert, not the other way around. She had to, because of protocol. She also despised being pregnant, calling it the shadow side of marriage and referring to her newborn babies as ugly, frog-like creatures. In her old age, after decades as the symbol of Britain, she learned to speak Hindustani from an Indian servant she adored, and the imposing empress we see in photographs was barely 5 feet tall. The public image of Queen Victoria is clear. She is the woman in black. After Prince Albert died in 1861, she wore mourning clothes for the next 40 years until her own death. This image defined her. She became the stoic, prim, and proper embodiment of the era that bears her name. The phrase, "we are not amused," is attached to her, painting a picture of a stern, humorless monarch. She was the grandmother of Europe, a remote and powerful figurehead of a vast empire, her face stamped on coins and statues across the globe. This was the queen her people knew. She was an institution, not a person. But the private Victoria was a different woman entirely. Her own diaries and letters reveal a person of intense passion, fiery temper, and deep emotion. Before Albert, as a young queen, she loved to dance until dawn. She was a skilled artist, filling sketchbooks with drawings. She had a close, almost father-daughter relationship with her first Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne. She was not the passive, stuffy figure of legend. She was vibrant. Her marriage to Albert was a true love match, one of overwhelming passion. Her journal entries about him are filled with adoration. They were not just husband and wife, they were partners. But they also had terrible fights. Victoria had a famous temper, and they would shout at each other, with Albert sometimes storming out and locking himself in his room. She would slip notes under the door to apologize. This was not the serene, controlled monarch of public perception. This was a real marriage, with all its complexities. She relied on Albert for everything, not just emotional support. He effectively ran the country with her, organizing the royal finances, championing the Great Exhibition of 1851, and advising her on every political decision. His death didn't just break her heart, it ripped away the very foundation of her life and her reign. The 40 years of mourning were genuine. Her grief was profound and debilitating. She retreated from public life for years, earning her the nickname, the Widow of Windsor. But even within that grief, her private personality shone through in unexpected ways. She formed 2 significant and controversial friendships in her widowhood. The first was with John Brown, a Scottish gillie from Balmoral. In public, he was just a servant. In private, he was her closest companion. He was blunt, informal, and treated her like a human being, not a queen. He'd tell her to put her coat on if it was cold. He called her woman. Rumors swirled about their relationship, but what is certain is that he provided the emotional support and straightforward companionship she desperately needed. He brought her out of her shell of grief. After Brown's death, another unconventional friendship filled the void. Abdul Karim, an Indian man sent to her as a gift for her golden jubilee, became her munshi, or teacher. He taught her Hindustani and told her about life in India. She promoted him, showered him with gifts, and treated him like a son. This caused immense friction within the royal household and with the government. They saw a commoner, an Indian, getting far too close to the Empress. But for Victoria, he was a connection to her vast empire, and more importantly, another person who treated her with simple, honest affection. So why the huge gap between the public image and the private person? It was a necessity of the times. A female monarch in the 19th century had to be a symbol of stability and morality. Her passions, her temper, her reliance on her husband, and her controversial friendships did not fit that mold. The image of the grieving widow, on the other hand, was powerful. It resonated with a public that valued family and duty. The Stoic empress was a symbol of strength for an expanding empire. The private Victoria, the passionate, stubborn, lonely, and surprisingly warm woman, had to stay behind the palace walls. The mask she wore was for the good of the crown. Number 19 was the Virgin Queen, a lovelorn woman. Elizabeth I of England famously never took a husband, a fact that earned her the title of the Virgin Queen. Her official portraits show her covered in pearls, symbols of purity, with a face like a pale, untouchable mask. Her most famous speech, delivered to her troops at Tilbury in 1588, presented her as having the heart and stomach of a king. This was her public brand, a monarch married only to her country, a Protestant icon, a ruler who had sacrificed personal happiness for the good of her people. She was Gloriana, above the messy emotions that ruled ordinary men and women. This image was a masterpiece of political strategy. In a world dominated by male rulers, an unmarried queen was an anomaly. By staying single, Elizabeth kept English foreign policy flexible. She could dangle the possibility of marriage to French or Spanish princes for decades, playing rival powers against each other without ever committing England to a dangerous alliance. Her virginity became her greatest diplomatic weapon. It made her seem dedicated, strong, and in complete control. But behind this carefully constructed facade was a woman of deep feelings and complex relationships. The idea that she was a cold, emotionless figure is a myth. The central relationship of her life was with Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. And they had known each other since childhood, having been imprisoned in the Tower of London at the same time by Elizabeth's half-sister Mary I. When Elizabeth became queen, their bond was immediate and intense. He was her master of the horse, a position that kept him constantly by her side. Their relationship was the subject of constant gossip and scandal across Europe. They were openly affectionate, and many believed they were lovers. The great obstacle was that Dudley was already married. His wife, Amy Robsart, was found dead at the bottom of a staircase in 1 to 560. While the official verdict was an accident, many suspected Dudley had arranged her death so he could marry the queen. The scandal was so great that marriage became impossible. It would have destroyed Elizabeth's reputation and possibly cost her the throne. But the connection between them never faded. For the rest of his life, Dudley remained the man she loved. Her letters to him, though often couched in the formal language of a monarch, hint at a deep personal bond. She called him her eyes, and his letters to her were signed with a symbol of an eye. When he died in 1588, she kept his last letter by her bedside until her own death 15 years later. On it, she wrote his last letter. Dudley was not the only one. Elizabeth had a weakness for handsome, charming men. She had favorites like Sir Christopher Hatton, who was said to have first caught her eye with his impressive dancing, and Sir Walter Raleigh. Her relationship with the much younger Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, dominated her later years. It was a stormy, passionate, almost mother-son or grandmother-grandson dynamic. She indulged him, but he was ambitious and reckless. Their arguments were legendary. He once turned his back on her in a Privy Council meeting, an act of supreme disrespect. She slapped him. He reached for his sword before being restrained. In the end, his ambition led him to treason, and she had to sign his death warrant in 1601. It is said to have broken her heart. These relationships show a woman who was not above emotion. She was capable of great love, jealousy, and rage. She was not a cold statue, but a person who felt things deeply. She simply could not let those feelings dictate her actions as queen. Her duty came first. The public image of the Virgin Queen was a political necessity. It projected strength and independence. The private Elizabeth was a woman who had to sacrifice her personal desires for her crown. She chose to be a great queen rather than a wife, but that choice came at a great personal cost. The mask of the untouchable Gloriana hid a heart that was all too human. Number 18 was the cake queen, a simple homebody. Marie Antoinette's public image is one of the most infamous in history. She is the queen of excess, the symbol of the French monarchy's detachment from its people. The phrase, "let them eat cake," though she likely never said it, has stuck to her for centuries. She was portrayed in pamphlets and popular press as frivolous, a foreign Austrian who spent a fortune on towering hairstyles, lavish gowns, and gambling, while the people of France starved. She was seen as a meddling, empty-headed party girl who cared for nothing but her own pleasure. This image fueled the revolution and ultimately led her to the guillotine. This caricature was powerful because it contained a kernel of truth. In her early years at Versailles, she was young, homesick, and out of her depth. She was married at 14 to the socially awkward Dauphin, the future Louis XVI. The French court was a viper's nest of etiquette and intrigue. To cope, she did retreat into a circle of close friends and a world of fashion and entertainment. She commissioned the Petit Trianon, a small chateau on the grounds of Versailles, as her private escape. There, she and her friends could shed the suffocating court protocol. She built a fantasy peasant village, the Hameau de la Reine, where she could play at being a milkmaid. These actions, intended as a private escape, were seen by the public as the ultimate display of her cluelessness and extravagance. They looked like she was mocking their poverty, but the private Marie Antoinette was far more complex than the cartoon villain she was made out to be. The woman behind the public mask was, at her core, a devoted mother and a loyal wife who longed for a simpler life. Her primary focus, especially after the birth of her first child in 1778, was her family. Her letters are filled with tender concern for her children's health and education. She personally oversaw their upbringing, a departure from the royal tradition of handing children over to governesses. She commissioned simple, comfortable cotton dresses for herself and her daughter, a move that, ironically, was also criticized. The public saw it not as a desire for simplicity, but as a rejection of French silk and tradition. Her relationship with Louis XVI was also misunderstood. Initially, it was a difficult and awkward pairing. But over time, they developed a deep and genuine affection. He was a quiet, shy man who preferred locksmithing and hunting to court life. She was a social butterfly. But they bonded over their shared duty and their love for their children. As the revolution intensified, she became his staunchest supporter and closest advisor. The frivolous girl had grown into a politically engaged woman. She was not a brilliant strategist, but she was fiercely protective of her family and the monarchy she had married into. The real tragedy of Marie Antoinette is that her attempts to be a more private, normal person were what doomed her public image. Her retreat to the Petit Trianon was seen as exclusive and insulting. Her desire for a close-knit group of friends was seen as favoritism. Her simpler style of dress was seen as unqueenly. She was trapped. When she tried to conform to the old ways of Versailles, she was criticized for her extravagance. When she tried to create a more modern, private family life, she was criticized for being aloof and breaking with tradition. In her final days, stripped of all her finery and imprisoned with her family, the true Marie Antoinette emerged. Eyewitness accounts from her captivity describe a woman of immense dignity, courage, and grace. The queen, who was accused of caring for nothing, showed incredible strength for her children. The caricature of the selfish airhead was replaced by the reality of a frightened but resolute mother and wife facing an unimaginable fate. The public image was a political weapon used against her. The private person was a far more sympathetic and ultimately tragic figure. Number 17 was the great enlightened empress, a scared outsider. Catherine the Great of Russia. Her public image was formidable. She was the enlightened despot, a friend of Voltaire and Diderot, a patron of the arts and sciences who brought Russia into the modern age. She expanded the Russian Empire, defeating the Ottoman Turks and partitioning Poland. She projected an image of immense power, intellectual brilliance, and absolute control. She was the Semiramis of the North, a larger-than-life figure who ruled a vast nation with an iron will. She wrote laws, founded schools, and collected one of the world's greatest art collections, which became the Hermitage Museum. This was the Catherine the world knew, confident, powerful, and thoroughly Russian. But this powerful empress began her life as a minor German princess named Sophie. She arrived in Russia at age 14 to marry the heir, the future Peter III. She was a complete outsider. She had no Russian blood, no friends, and no power. Her husband was immature and cruel to her. She was in a foreign court surrounded by people who viewed her with suspicion. The private Catherine, for much of her early life, was a lonely, frightened, and insecure young woman. She understood from day one that her survival depended on becoming more Russian than the Russians. She threw herself into learning the language, practicing at night until her voice was hoarse. She converted to Russian Orthodoxy with a public display of devout faith. She read voraciously, educating herself in history, philosophy, and political theory. This was not just intellectual curiosity, it was a survival mechanism. She was building the foundations for her future rule, creating a new identity for herself. While her husband alienated the court and the military, with his obsession with his native Prussia, Catherine was quietly winning allies and building a base of support. The public image of absolute control was a necessary illusion. She came to power in a coup in 1762, overthrowing her own husband, who was murdered shortly after. She was a usurper with a questionable claim to the throne. She ruled for 34 years, but she never forgot that her power was not guaranteed. She lived with the constant fear of being overthrown herself. Her enlightened correspondence with French philosophers was part of her public relations campaign. It broadcast an image of a progressive modern ruler to the rest of Europe, legitimizing her reign. In private, she was plagued by insecurities. She was deeply sensitive about her appearance and her German origins. She relied heavily on a series of favorites, powerful men who were not just her lovers, but her closest advisors and partners in governance. And Grigory Potemkin was the most significant. Their relationship was a partnership of equals. He was her co-ruler in many ways, a brilliant and flamboyant strategist who managed her military campaigns and governed the newly acquired southern territories. Her letters to him reveal a vulnerable, passionate woman, not the cold, calculating empress of public record. She shared her fears, her doubts, and her triumphs with him. The vast gulf between her public image and her private reality was a matter of political necessity. To rule Russia as a foreign woman who had seized the throne, she had to project an aura of unshakable confidence and supreme intellect. She had to be Catherine the Great. The private Sophie, the German princess, who was once lonely and afraid, had to be buried. She created a persona, and she played the part so brilliantly that the world accepted it as reality. But behind the imperial facade was a woman who had fought for everything she had and never stopped feeling the precariousness of her position. Number 16 was the world's most beautiful empress obsessed with being invisible. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known as Sisi, was a superstar of the 19th century. Her public image was that of a fairy tale beauty. She was famous for her floor-length chestnut hair, which took hours to braid, and her impossibly slim waist, maintained by a punishing diet and exercise regimen. Portraits and photographs showed a stunning, ethereal woman, the epitome of royal grace and glamour. She was the wife of Emperor Franz Joseph I, the ruler of the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire. To the public, she was a fashion icon and a romantic figure, a beautiful ornament to the rigid Habsburg court. But this was a role she despised. The private Sisi was a shy, melancholic, and deeply unconventional woman who felt suffocated by court life. She was an introvert forced in the most public of roles. The endless ceremonies, the strict etiquette, the constant scrutiny, she found it all unbearable. She was just 16 when she married Franz Joseph, who had originally been intended for her older sister. She was unprepared for the rigid formality of the Viennese court, which she called her prison. Her obsession with her beauty was not vanity in the traditional sense. It was a desperate attempt to control one aspect of her life when everything else was controlled by others. Her famous hair was so long and heavy, it gave her headaches. Her tight lacing of corsets to achieve a 19-inch waist was extreme. She spent hours each day exercising with gym equipment installed in her royal chambers. This wasn't about public admiration. It was a private obsession, a way to focus her anxious energy and maintain a sense of self in a world that was trying to erase her. In private, Sisi was a poet and an intellectual. She wrote melancholic verses, heavily influenced by the German poet Heinrich Heine, expressing her feelings of loneliness and despair. She was a restless spirit who hated being tied down. She found her only real happiness in travel. She used her health, both real and imagined ailments, as an excuse to escape Vienna for long periods. She traveled to Madeira, Corfu, England, and Ireland, anywhere she could be free from the prying eyes of the court. On the Greek island of Corfu, she built a palace, the Achillean, dedicated to the hero Achilles, a figure she identified with. As she grew older, she took extreme measures to hide from the public gaze that had once defined her. The beautiful empress became obsessed with her own invisibility. She would carry a fan or a parasol, not to shield her from the sun, but to hide her face from onlookers. She refused to be photographed or have her portrait painted after her early 30s, wanting the world to remember her only as a young beauty. The public image was frozen in time while the private woman aged in seclusion. Her relationship with her husband was complex. Franz Joseph loved her deeply, but he was a creature of duty and routine who could not understand her free spirit. He indulged her travels and her spending because it was the only way he could keep her. Her relationship with her children was also difficult. Her first two daughters were taken from her to be raised by her formidable mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie. The death of her first child, Sophie, at age 2, was a trauma from which she never fully recovered. Her only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, was a source of constant worry, and his death in a pact at his hunting lodge in Merling in 1889 shattered what was left of her spirit. The public saw a beautiful, distant, and perhaps eccentric empress. The reality was a deeply sad, introverted woman, a poet and a horsewoman, who felt like a caged bird. She created a public self based on beauty, and then spent the rest of her life trying to escape it. Number 15 was the perfect queen consort, secretly a rebel. Queen Mary of Teck, the wife of King George V of the United Kingdom, had a public image that was flawless. She was the epitome of royal duty and decorum. Her style was formal and unchanging, upright posture, 2 cats, and magnificent jewels. She was seen as stern, regal, and unemotional. She was the matriarch of the House of Windsor, a symbol of stability and tradition through the turmoil of the First World War, the abdication of her eldest son, and the beginning of her granddaughter Elizabeth II's reign. She was, in the public mind, the perfect queen consort, dignified, dependable, and utterly conventional. But behind that formidable, diamond-encrusted exterior was a woman of surprising intellectual depth and a quiet, rebellious spirit. The private Mary was a passionate and knowledgeable collector of art and antiques, with a curator's eye for detail. She wasn't just acquiring pretty things, she was a serious historian of the royal collection. She spent countless hours cataloging and arranging furniture, porcelain, and jewels, often to the annoyance of her less historically minded relatives. She would visit their homes and point out that a certain painting or piece of furniture had once belonged to a previous monarch and really ought to be returned to the main collection. This earned her a reputation for being a bit of a royal magpie, but it came from a deep love and respect for history, not greed. She was also far more intelligent and well-read than her stiff public persona suggested. She had a sharp mind and a dry wit that only those closest to her ever saw. While her husband, George V, was a simple man who enjoyed stamp collecting and shooting, Mary was intellectually curious. She felt a duty to improve her mind and stay informed. This intellectual streak was something she had to keep largely to herself, as it didn't fit the expected mold of a queen consort. Her early life shaped her complex personality. She was born Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, a minor royal with a slightly complicated background. Her mother was a British princess, but her father was a German duke of lesser rank. They were not wealthy and lived a peripatetic life, sometimes fleeing creditors. This experience gave Mary a deep appreciation for stability and a keen understanding of the importance of maintaining royal dignity. It also made her determined to be the perfect queen. She was initially engaged to the heir to the throne, Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence. But he died of influenza just weeks before their wedding in 1892. In a move that seems strange today but was practical then, she became engaged to his younger brother, the new heir, George. Their marriage was not a passionate love match at first, but it grew into a partnership of deep affection and mutual respect. He relied on her judgment and her strength. The greatest evidence of her private strength and her deviation from the public image of a passive consort came during the abdication crisis of 1936. Her eldest son, King Edward Veed, was determined to marry the American divorcee Wallis Simpson. The establishment, the government, and the public were against it. The Queen Mary was devastated. She was a stickler for duty and tradition, and she saw her son's actions as a complete betrayal of his responsibility. But Her reaction was not just one of a stern, unbending traditionalist. It was the reaction of a mother whose heart was broken. In her private diaries, her anguish is clear. She was forced to choose between her love for her son and her duty to the crown. She chose the crown, and her relationship with her eldest son never recovered. The public saw a woman of iron. The private Mary was a woman of intellect, historical passion, and deep, though rarely expressed emotion. Her rigid public persona was a shield, a uniform she wore to perform her role flawlessly. It was the product of a lifetime of duty, but it concealed a far more interesting and complex woman than the world ever knew. Number 14 was the People's Princess, a master of the media. Diana, Princess of Wales, had a public image that evolved dramatically, but its final form was that of the People's Princess. She was seen as a victim of a cold, unfeeling royal family, a loving mother, a compassionate humanitarian, and a fashion icon. The public saw her as shy, vulnerable, and emotionally open. Her famous 1995 television interview, where she spoke of her unhappiness and the pressures of royal life, cemented this image. She was Queen of Hearts, a woman who connected with ordinary people on a human level, whether she was hugging a patient with AIDS or walking through a minefield in Angola. She seemed genuine, spontaneous, and refreshingly real compared to the stiff upper lip of the monarchy. This image was not false, but it was incomplete. Behind the vulnerability and compassion was a shrewd and determined woman who understood the power of the media better than anyone. The private Diana was not a passive victim. She was an active participant in the creation of her own narrative. She learned very early on how to use the press to her advantage. The shy Sloane Ranger, who looked down through her fringe in her engagement photos, grew into a woman who could command the front page of every newspaper in the world with a single, perfectly timed appearance. She had a direct line to several journalists and biographers. Andrew Morton's explosive 1992 book, Diana, Her True Story, which exposed the misery of her marriage and her struggles, was presented as being written with the help of her friends. Years later, it was confirmed that Diana herself was the primary source, smuggling tape-recorded confessions to Morton through an intermediary. This was not the act of a powerless victim. It was a calculated move to get her side of the story out to the public, to fight back against the palace machine that she felt was trying to silence her. She knew the power of a single photograph. When her marriage was publicly crumbling, pictures of her sitting alone in front of the Taj Mahal, a monument to love, spoke volumes without her having to say a word. She timed her public appearances to upstage her husband or other members of the royal family. She understood that in the modern age, the battle for public opinion was fought in the pages of newspapers and on the evening news. She was a master of this modern form of court politics. Her humanitarian work was genuine. She had a deep well of empathy and a real desire to help people. But it was also a way for her to build a new, powerful identity for herself, separate from the royal family. Her work with landmine victims and AIDS patients gave her a global platform and immense public goodwill. These were causes the palace was initially hesitant about. By embracing them, she showed she was a different kind of royal, one who was in touch with the real world. This was both a sincere passion and a brilliant strategic move. The private Diana was also a woman of contradictions. She craved a private life, but also courted publicity when it suited her. She complained about press intrusion, but would also tip off photographers about her whereabouts. She was strong and calculating in her media strategy, but also emotionally fragile and in need of constant reassurance. She was not a simple character. She was complex, driven, and at times manipulative. The public image of the simple, wide-eyed victim is a disservice to her. It strips her of her agency. The private Diana was a fighter. She was a woman who found herself in an impossible situation and used the only weapons at her disposal, her charm, her compassion, and her mastery of the media, to survive and to shape her own destiny. The People's Princess was a powerful public role, but the woman who created it was a far more formidable and complicated figure than the legend suggests. Number 13 was the Dutiful Empress, a woman of fire. and Empress Michiko of Japan, wife of Emperor Akihito, has a public image of perfect, serene grace. She is the first commoner ever to marry into the Japanese imperial family, the world's oldest continuous monarchy. For decades, her public persona has been one of quiet dignity, gentle smiles, and flawless execution of her ceremonial duties. She is seen as a devoted wife and mother, a talented pianist, and a symbol of a more modern, approachable Japanese monarchy. Her style is elegant and conservative. She rarely speaks in public, and when she does, it is with carefully chosen, humble words. She is the picture of traditional Japanese femininity, modest, self-effacing, and dedicated to her family and her duty. But this serene image hides a private story of immense stress, personal suffering, and quiet strength. The pressure on Michiko Shoto when she married the crown prince in 1959 was unimaginable. She was not just a commoner, she was from a Roman Catholic family, entering the very heart of the Shinto-based imperial institution. She faced intense opposition and criticism from traditionalists within the imperial household agency, the powerful bureaucracy that controls every aspect of the imperial family's life. Her mother-in-law, Empress Kojin, was said to have disapproved of her, leading to a period of intense bullying and isolation for the young princess. The private Michiko was not a passive recipient of this treatment. She was a woman of strong will who fought quiet battles to maintain her identity and raise her children in a more normal way. In a radical break with tradition, she insisted on raising her 3 children herself rather than handing them over to court chamberlains and wet nurses. She cooked for them, read to them, and packed their school lunches. This was a private rebellion against the rigid impersonal traditions of the palace. It was her way of creating a small pocket of normalcy in a completely artificial world. The strain of her life took a severe physical and mental toll. In the early 1960s, she suffered a breakdown and retreated from public life for several months. In 1993, after a period of particularly harsh and baseless media criticism, she collapsed and temporarily lost her voice. For several months, she could only communicate by writing notes. This was not the act of a woman who was serene and unaffected. It was the physical manifestation of the immense, relentless pressure she had been under for decades. Her silence was a powerful, though involuntary statement about the pain she had endured. In private, Michiko is a woman of great culture and intellect. She is a published poet, a skilled musician, and fluent in English. She has a deep love of literature and has translated the works of a Japanese children's poet into English. This intellectual and artistic side is rarely seen by the public, overshadowed by her ceremonial role. Her relationship with Emperor Akihito is a source of her strength. Theirs is a genuine love story. He chose her over all the aristocratic candidates presented to him, and he has been her staunchest defender against the critics within the court. Their public appearances together show a quiet but obvious affection. They are partners. He has relied on her to help him shape a new, more compassionate style of monarchy, one that focuses on comforting victims of natural disasters and reaching out to the marginalized. The public sees the perfect, placid empress. The private reality is that of a trailblazer who endured immense personal hardship to modernize an ancient institution from within. Her grace is not a sign of passivity. It is a sign of incredible resilience. She absorbed the pressures and the criticisms and channeled her energy into her family and her quiet determination to be a new kind of empress. The gentle smile is a mask of courage, hiding the story of a woman who fought for her place and paid a heavy price for it. Number 12 was the Merry Monarch's sister, a political genius, and Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon, the younger sister of Queen Elizabeth II, had a public image that was a whirlwind of glamour, controversy, and perceived self-indulgence. She was the royal rebel, the party girl, who loved jazz clubs, long cigarette holders, and charismatic men. She was seen as beautiful, witty, and charming, but also as difficult, demanding, and often petulant. Her life was defined in the public eye by her doomed love affair with the divorced group Captain Peter Townsend, and her turbulent marriage to the photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones. She was the fun-loving, slightly tragic figure who lived in the shadow of her more dutiful sister. Her persona was that of a princess who put her own desires before her duty. This image of a fun but frivolous royal was not entirely inaccurate, but it completely overshadowed her intelligence and her surprising effectiveness as a royal representative. The private Princess Margaret was sharp, well-read, and had a deep understanding of her constitutional role. She was not just a party girl, she was often a hard-working and successful envoy for the crown. From a young age, Margaret was seen as the more vivacious and outgoing of the two sisters. While Elizabeth was serious and methodical, Margaret was artistic and theatrical. Their father, King George VI, famously said, "Lilibet is my pride, Margaret is my joy." But this also meant that from an early age she was cast in the role of the spare, the one with less responsibility and more freedom. This was a role she both enjoyed and resented. In private, she was a fierce defender of her sister and the monarchy. She took her duty seriously. On royal tours, she could be incredibly effective. She was a natural performer, and her glamour and wit often charmed foreign dignitaries and crowds. On a tour of the Caribbean in the 1950s, she was a massive success. She was a key figure in the transition of many Commonwealth countries from colonies to independent nations. She understood the soft power that royalty could wield, and she was very good at it. These successful tours were often overshadowed in the press by reports of her late-night partying or her demanding behavior. The Townsend affair in the 1950s defined her public image for a generation. She fell in love with a divorced man, a hero of the Battle of Britain, but an unsuitable husband for a princess so close to the throne. The government and the Church of England opposed the match. In the end, Margaret was forced to choose between Townsend and her royal position. In a public statement in 1955, she announced she had chosen her duty. This was seen as a great personal sacrifice, but it also cemented her image as a tragic romantic figure. What is less known is the intense pressure she was under. It was not a simple choice between love and duty. It was a constitutional crisis in the making. Her marriage to Anthony Armstrong Jones, a commoner and a bohemian photographer, was initially seen as a modern fairy tale. But their personalities were too volatile to coexist peacefully. Their private life was a storm of passionate arguments and competition for the spotlight. Yet, during the early years of their marriage, they were a glamorous and modernizing force for the monarchy, surrounding themselves with artists, actors, and intellectuals. This was Margaret's world, a world of creativity and sharp conversation that she could not find within the more staid confines of the palace. The public saw the glamour and the drama. They saw the holidays on the Caribbean island of Moustique and the high-profile divorce. They did not see the woman who, in her quieter moments, was a patron of the arts, particularly ballet, and a loyal, if complex, sister and aunt. Her wit could be cutting, and her demands for deference could be grating. But this was perhaps the defense mechanism of a woman who was never quite sure of her place. She had all the training and status of a top-tier royal, but was given no real substantive job. The public image of the royal rebel was partly of her own making, but it was also the role society had assigned to her. The sharp, capable woman underneath was rarely allowed to show through. Number 11. Was Bloody Mary just a scared woman? Queen Mary, Eye of England, is known to history by one name: Bloody Mary. Her public image is that of a religious fanatic, a bitter and cruel queen who had hundreds of Protestants burned at the stake in her fanatical quest to return England to Catholicism. She is portrayed as a grim, joyless tyrant, the dark and bloody interlude between the reigns of her Protestant half-brother Edward VI and her glorious half-sister Elizabeth I. This image was cemented by Protestant propagandists after her death and has endured for centuries. But this one-dimensional portrait of a monster ignores the deeply human and tragic story of the woman behind the throne. The Private Mary was not born a fanatic. She was forged by a lifetime of trauma, rejection, and profound insecurity. For the first 16 years of her life, she was a pampered and adored princess, the cherished only child of King Henry VI and Catherine of Aragon. She was well-educated, a talented musician, and the acknowledged heir to the English throne. Her world shattered when her father fell in love with Anne Boleyn and sought to annul his marriage to her mother. In his desperate quest for a male heir, Henry broke with the Catholic Church, declared his marriage to Catherine invalid, and declared his own daughter, Mary, illegitimate. In an instant, she went from being Princess Mary to the Lady Mary. She was stripped of her titles, her household, and her place in the line of succession. She was separated from her mother, whom she would never see again. She was forced to serve as a lady in waiting to her infant half-sister Elizabeth, the daughter of the woman she saw as her mother's destroyer. She lived in constant fear for her life, under immense pressure to accept her father's new church and her own illegitimacy. She refused. Her Catholic faith became the bedrock of her identity, the one thing they could not take from her. It was her connection to her mother and her claim to legitimacy. When she finally came to the throne in 1553, after the brief and contested reign of Lady Jane Grey, she was 37 years old. She was the first queen regnant of England, a position for which there was no precedent. She was a middle-aged woman who had spent 2 decades in political and personal wilderness. Her primary goals were to restore the Catholic faith she believed was essential for her country's salvation, and to produce a Catholic heir to secure the succession. Her decision to marry Prince Philip of Spain, a powerful Catholic monarch but a foreigner, was deeply unpopular. It fueled fears that England would become a Spanish pawn, but for Mary it was a necessary alliance and her only chance for a child. The private Mary desperately wanted to be a wife and mother. She twice believed she was pregnant, suffering from phantom pregnancies that were likely the result of a medical condition and intense wishful thinking. Each time, the court prepared for a royal birth, and each time it ended in national humiliation and personal devastation for the queen. The religious persecutions for which she is infamous were driven by this deep-seated piety and a genuine, if tragically misguided, belief that she was saving the souls of her people. The burnings were horrific, and they were a catastrophic political mistake, turning public opinion against her and her faith. But they were not the acts of a bloodthirsty monster. They were the policies of a devout and rigid ruler, in line with practices common across Europe at the time for dealing with heresy. The private Mary was a woman racked by anxiety. She was not the confident, ruthless ruler of her father's mold. She was deeply in love with a husband who found her plain and spent most of their marriage abroad. She was a queen who yearned for the love of her people, but ended up being feared and reviled. Her public image as a bloody tyrant was the product of her political failures. The private woman was a survivor of a brutal childhood, a lonely and often frightened ruler trying to restore the world she had lost. Her story is not one of simple villainy, but of profound tragedy. Number 10 was the Ice Queen, a woman of passion. Queen Christina of Sweden was one of the most unconventional monarchs of the 17th century. Her public image was that of a brilliant but cold intellectual, the Minerva of the North. She was raised as a prince, receiving a rigorous education in philosophy, languages, and statecraft. She was the patron of the philosopher René Descartes, whom she famously summoned to her court in Stockholm. She was seen as a serious, masculine figure, uninterested in the traditional female pursuits of marriage and motherhood. Her decision to abdicate her throne in 1654 and convert to Catholicism stunned Europe and cemented her image as an eccentric, unpredictable, and emotionally detached ruler. She was a queen of the mind, not the heart. But the private Christina was a woman of intense passions, deep emotional attachments, and a rebellious spirit that chafed against every convention of her time. The Cold Ice Queen persona was a shield she used to navigate a world that had no place for a woman like her. From birth, her life was unusual. Her father, the great warrior king Gustavus Adolphus, ordered that she be raised as a boy after he died in battle when she was 6. She was a brilliant student, but she was also lonely. Her mother initially rejected her for not being a boy and was later deemed too unstable to raise her. And Christina grew up in a largely male world of politics and scholarship. Her closest and most intense emotional relationship was with a woman, her beautiful lady-in-waiting, Ebba Spar. Christina's letters to Ebba are filled with passionate romantic language. She called Ebba Belle and wrote of how she was destined to be loved by her. The exact nature of their relationship is debated by historians, but it is clear that it was the central emotional connection of Christina's life in Sweden. This deep capacity for love and attachment is a stark contrast to her public image as a cold, unfeeling intellectual. Her decision to abdicate was not a cold, rational calculation. It was the ultimate act of a passionate and rebellious individual. She had several reasons. She had no desire to marry and produce an heir, which was the primary duty of a monarch. She felt the burdens of rule were crushing her spirit. But most importantly, she had secretly converted to Catholicism, an impossible faith for the monarch of Lutheran Sweden, a country that was the champion of the Protestant cause in Europe. Her abdication was an act of personal and spiritual liberation. She was choosing her own soul over her kingdom. After leaving Sweden, she traveled Europe as a celebrity, a woman without a country or a defined role. She settled in Rome, where she established a new court and became a major patron of art, music, and theater. Her behavior continued to shock. She dressed in men's clothing, engaged in political intrigue, and her private life was the subject of endless gossip. She had another intense and this time public emotional attachment to a man, the Cardinal Decio Azzolino. He became her closest confidant, her political advisor, and the sole heir to her vast collections. Their correspondence reveals a deep and lasting, though likely platonic, partnership. The public saw a woman who was a bundle of contradictions, a brilliant scholar who behaved scandalously, a former queen who meddled in politics, a devout Catholic who lived an unconventional life. They saw her as an eccentric, a curiosity. But the private Christina was a woman who was searching for a place to be herself. She was too intelligent, too passionate, and too hungry for freedom to fit into the narrow box of a 17th century queen. The Ice Queen image was the one she presented as a ruler. The passionate, searching, and sometimes reckless woman was who she truly was. She gave up a throne for the freedom to be that person. Number 9 was the fierce warrior queen, a reluctant ruler. Wu Zetian is the only woman to have ever ruled China in her own right as empress regnant. Her public image, crafted largely by her male Confucian successors, is that of a ruthless, power-hungry usurper who stopped at nothing to seize the throne. She is accused of being cruel, manipulative, and immoral. Official histories claim she disposed of rivals, including members of her own family, with cold efficiency. She is portrayed as a woman who violated the natural order of things by taking on the ultimate male role. This image of a female tyrant, a dragon lady, has dominated her legacy for centuries, but a closer look at her life and reign reveals a far more complex picture. The private Wu Zetian was an exceptionally intelligent and politically gifted woman who was also a product of the brutal court politics of her time. And there is evidence to suggest that her path to ultimate power was not a single-minded quest from the beginning, but a gradual process in which she proved herself more capable than any of the men around her. She entered the court of Emperor Taizong as a junior concubine at the age of 14. She was beautiful and intelligent, but the emperor did not favor her. It was his son, the crown prince Li Ji, who fell in love with her. This was a dangerous, forbidden relationship. When Taizong died, all his childless concubines, including Wu, were sent to a Buddhist monastery to live out their days. This should have been the end of her story. But the new emperor, now known as Gaozong, was still in love with her. In an unprecedented move, he brought her back to the palace. This was the first sign of her extraordinary ability to survive and thrive. She outmaneuvered her rivals at court, including the Empress Wang and the favored consort Zhao, to become Empress Consort in 655. The histories written by her enemies accuse her of smothering her own infant daughter and blaming it on the Empress to achieve this, a horrific story for which there is no contemporary evidence. It is more likely a piece of character assassination written later to justify her removal from the historical record. For many years, she ruled alongside her husband, who was often in poor health. He trusted her judgment completely. The private Wu Zetian was a capable and effective administrator. She was his partner in power, not just a wife. Official court business was often decided by the two of them together. They were known as the Two Sages. This was her long political apprenticeship. She learned how to govern by governing. When Emperor Gaozong died in 683, she became regent for her sons. But she found them to be weak and ineffective rulers, easily manipulated by their own wives and court factions. It was at this point that she made her most audacious move. In 690, she declared herself Empress Regnant, founding her own dynasty, the Zhou. This was not just a power grab. It was a calculated move by a woman who had been at the center of power for over 30 years and believed she was the only one capable of ruling the empire effectively. Her public image as a tyrant is contradicted by the state of China during her reign. It was largely a period of peace and prosperity. She was a skilled administrator who promoted talented officials regardless of their social standing. She reformed the civil service examination system, making it more meritocratic. She promoted Buddhism as a state religion, which helped to legitimize her rule as a woman. She was also surprisingly tolerant of her critics, often ignoring or demoting them rather than executing them, which was common practice. The private Wu Zetian was a woman who was likely both ruthless and brilliant, because that's what it took to survive and rule in that environment. But she was not the one-dimensional monster of Confucian legend. She was a woman who broke every rule and shattered every precedent to reach the pinnacle of power. The negative public image was a backlash, an attempt by a patriarchal system to erase the memory of a woman who proved she could do a man's job better than any man. Number 8. Was the perfect princess a prisoner? Queen Alexandra of Denmark, wife of King Edward VII of the United Kingdom, was beloved by the British public. Her image was that of a beautiful, graceful, and eternally youthful fairy tale princess. She arrived in Britain in 1863 to marry the Prince of Wales, and the nation fell in love with her. She was a fashion trendsetter, popularizing the choker necklace to hide a small scar on her neck and a particular style of dress. She was seen as a devoted wife and a loving mother, the picture of domestic virtue. Even in old age, she maintained an image of delicate, almost fragile beauty. She was charitable, kind, and always smiling for the cameras. She was, in the public eye, the perfect princess. But this perfect image concealed a life of private sadness, profound loneliness, and quiet suffering. The private Alexandra was a woman who felt like an outsider in her own family and who endured personal tragedies and public humiliations with a forced smile. Her marriage to Bertie, the Prince of Wales, was not the fairy tale it appeared to be. He was a notorious philanderer, and his numerous affairs were an open secret. Alexandra was aware of his infidelity throughout their long marriage. This caused her immense private pain. Yet, the conventions of the time required her to maintain a dignified public silence. She had to stand by him, smiling, while the whole world knew of his mistresses. In a strange twist of Victorian duty, she was even civil to some of them, including his last great love, Alice Keppel. This was not a sign of acceptance, but of the incredible self-control and sense of duty she possessed. Another source of private sorrow was her increasing deafness. She had inherited a genetic condition, otosclerosis, which worsened over time. This made social situations, the very heart of royal life, incredibly difficult for her. It isolated her, cutting her off from conversations and making her appear aloof or absent-minded when she simply couldn't hear. She developed a habit of smiling brightly and nodding, a social mask to hide her struggle. The public saw a serene and happy princess, not a woman who was living in an increasingly silent world. She was also intellectually isolated. The court of her mother-in-law, Queen Victoria, was stuffy and formal. Alexandra was not an intellectual, and she was often treated as a beautiful but empty-headed ornament. Her husband's circle, the Marlborough House set, was fast-living and focused on pleasure. She was not a part of that either. Her real joy was in her children, on whom she doted, perhaps to an unhealthy degree. She kept them close, treating them like children long after they were grown. The death of her eldest son, Prince Albert Victor, in 1892 was a devastating blow from which she never truly recovered. He was the heir to the throne, and his sudden death from influenza plunged her into a deep and lasting grief. Her public image of gentle grace hit a core of profound maternal sorrow. So why did she maintain the perfect public facade? Because it was her job. It was the role she was expected to play. As Princess of Wales and later as Queen Consort, her duty was to be a symbol of beauty, family, and stability. Her private feelings, her hurt, her loneliness, her grief had to be suppressed for the good of the monarchy. The smiling, beautiful princess was a mask she wore for over 50 years. The private Alexandra was a woman of immense fortitude, a prisoner of her royal role, who endured her private sorrows with a quiet dignity the public rarely saw. Number 7 was the pious queen, a ruthless politician. Isabella I of Castile is remembered as one of the great rulers of Spain, alongside her husband Ferdinand of Aragon. Her public image is overwhelmingly that of Isabella the Catholic. She was a devout, pious queen, a champion of the faith who completed the Reconquista by conquering the last Muslim kingdom of Granada in 1492. In the same year, she sponsored Christopher Columbus's voyage, an act often portrayed as being motivated by a desire to spread Christianity to new lands. She is seen as a woman of immense faith and moral certainty, the driving force behind the unification and purification of Spain. This image of piety is central to her legend, and her faith was undoubtedly sincere, but it overshadows the reality of who she was, a brilliant, shrewd, and often ruthless political operator who fought her way to the throne and wielded power with an iron fist. The private Isabella was not a gentle saint, but a master politician who used religion as a powerful tool of statecraft. Her claim to the throne of Castile was not secure. She had to fight a civil war against her own niece, Juana la Beltraneja, to win her crown. She did this with military skill and political cunning. She understood the importance of propaganda, presenting herself as the rightful and morally upright heir against the supposedly illegitimate Juana. She personally rode among her troops, wearing armor to inspire them. This was not the act of a cloistered, pious woman. This was the act of a warrior queen. Her marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon was a political masterstroke. It was a union of equals, a partnership that would eventually create the modern state of Spain. You know, the terms of their marriage contract were clear. She was Queen of Castile in her own right. She did not cede her power to her husband. In private, they were a formidable team, but she was always the senior partner in her own kingdom. She made her own decisions. The establishment of the Spanish Inquisition in 1478, often seen as the ultimate expression of her religious fanaticism, was also a deeply political act. The Inquisition was a tool used to enforce religious and social uniformity, which Isabella and Ferdinand saw as essential for creating a strong, centralized state. It was a way to control a diverse population and eliminate potential sources of dissent. Her piety provided the justification, but the goal was political power and state control. The same is true of the 1492 Alhambra decree, which expelled all Jews from Spain. While motivated by a desire for religious purity, it was also an act of nation building. It was a brutal and tragic policy, but from Isabella's perspective, it was a necessary step to create a single unified Catholic Spain. Her decisions were not just those of a religious zealot, they were the cold, hard calculations of a monarch consolidating power. Even the funding of Columbus was as much about politics and economics as it was about faith. Isabella and Ferdinand were looking for a new trade route to the Indies to compete with their rivals, the Portuguese. They saw the potential for immense wealth and geopolitical advantage. Spreading the faith was a genuine goal, but it went hand in hand with the quest for gold and glory. The private Isabella was a woman who understood power. She was disciplined, hardworking, and demanded absolute loyalty. She was a loving mother and a devoted wife, but she never let her personal feelings interfere with her political judgment. The public image of the pious saint is an oversimplification. She was a complex and formidable ruler who believed her political goals and her religious duties were one and the same. She used her faith to build a nation, and she was not afraid to be ruthless to achieve her ends. Number 6 was the last pharaoh more than a seductress. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, has a public image that has been shaped for over 2,000 years, mostly by her Roman enemies. She is the ultimate femme fatale, an exotic and beautiful seductress who used her charms to ensnare two of the most powerful men in the world, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. She is portrayed as a decadent, pleasure-loving queen who spent her time in luxurious barges and lavish banquets, ultimately leading her lover Antony and her kingdom to ruin. This image, popularized by Shakespeare and Hollywood, is of a woman ruled by passion, a queen who sacrificed her country for love. But this Roman propaganda, designed to justify their conquest of Egypt, hides the reality of a brilliant and capable ruler. The Private Cleopatra was a shrewd politician, a skilled diplomat, and a formidable intellectual who was desperately trying to save her kingdom from the ever-expanding power of Rome. Her relationships with Caesar and Antony were not just about love or lust. They were political alliances, her only hope for survival. Cleopatra was not just a pretty face. She was highly educated, a product of the great intellectual center of Alexandria. The Greek historian Plutarch, who is one of our main sources, says that her actual beauty was not in and for itself so remarkable, but that it was her conversation, her charm, and her intelligence that were truly captivating. She was the first ruler of her dynasty, the Ptolemies, to bother to learn the Egyptian language. She also spoke numerous other languages, which made her an effective diplomat. She understood economics and she managed her country's economy effectively, ensuring Egypt remained a rich and prosperous nation. Her relationship with Julius Caesar was a calculated political move. When he arrived in Egypt, she was in the midst of a civil war with her younger brother. Smuggling herself into his presence, rolled up in a carpet, was a dramatic and daring act designed to get a private audience with the most powerful man in the world. She needed his support to win her throne. He needed her and Egypt's vast wealth to fund his own political ambitions. Their alliance was mutually beneficial. Their son, Caesarion, was not just a child of love, he was a powerful symbol of a potential union between Rome and Egypt, a future that terrified the Roman Senate. After Caesar's assassination, she forged a new alliance with Mark Antony. Again, this was a political and military necessity. Rome was in chaos, and she needed a new protector. Antony, who controlled the eastern half of the Roman world, needed Egypt's money and resources to fight his rival, Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. Their famous love affair was real, and by all accounts, they had a genuine partnership. But it was always intertwined with geopolitics. They were a power couple, ruling the Eastern Mediterranean together. The image of them as decadent and lazy was crafted by Octavian's propaganda machine in Rome. He portrayed Antony as a weak, one Roman man who had been bewitched by a foreign queen, and Cleopatra as the great enemy of Rome. This was a political campaign to turn Roman public opinion against Antony and justify a war. It was a war not against a fellow Roman, but against a foreign threat. The private Cleopatra was a queen fighting for her country's independence in a world where that was becoming impossible. She used every tool at her disposal, her intellect, her wealth, her charm, and her political acumen. She was not a passive victim of her passions. She was an active, intelligent player in one of the most ruthless political games in history. She lost, and as the saying goes, history is written by the victors. The Romans wrote her story, and they created the image of the seductress to obscure the reality of the powerful queen who had dared to challenge them. Number 5 was the boring queen, a passionate friend. Queen Anne of Great Britain, the last monarch of the House of Stuart, has a public image of being a dull, unremarkable, and largely ineffective ruler. She is often remembered for being physically unimpressive overweight, constantly ill with gout, and enduring a heartbreaking series of 17 pregnancies, none of which resulted in an heir who survived to adulthood. Politically, she is seen as being weak and indecisive, easily manipulated by her powerful ministers and her female favorites. The popular image is of a boring, sickly queen who presided over a period of great change but had little to do with it herself. But this picture of a passive, uninteresting monarch is a caricature. The private Queen Anne was a woman of deep, passionate emotions, intense loyalties, and stubborn convictions. Her reign was not defined by her weakness, but by her complex and all-consuming female friendships, which had a profound impact on the politics of her time. The most important relationship of her life was with Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough. They had been friends since childhood, and Anne was shy and insecure. Sarah was beautiful, intelligent, and fiercely ambitious. They developed an incredibly close, almost codependent bond. In their private letters, they used pet names for each other. Anne was Mrs. Morley, and Sarah was Mrs. Freeman. This was Anne's attempt to create a private world where they could be equals. For years, Sarah was her closest confidante and advisor. When Anne became queen in 1702, Sarah's husband, the Duke of Marlborough, became the brilliant commander of the army, and Sarah herself held the most powerful positions at court. The two women effectively ran the country together with their husbands. This was not a relationship where a weak queen was manipulated by a powerful friend. It was a partnership, but a volatile one. Anne was not a puppet. She had strong opinions, particularly about the Church of England, which she was determined to protect. She was a devout Anglican, while Sarah was a firm supporter of the Whig Party, which was more tolerant of religious dissenters. For years, Sarah pressured, cajoled, and bullied Anne to appoint Whig ministers. Anne resisted, leading to furious arguments and long, emotional letters. Sarah's blunt, domineering personality, which Anne had once relied on, began to feel like harassment. The breakdown of their friendship was a major political event. As Anne grew tired of Sarah's hectoring, she turned to another, gentler friend, Abigail Masham. Abigail was a poor cousin of Sarah's whom Sarah had placed at court. She was quiet, sympathetic, and shared Anne's conservative Tory political views. She offered the queen the unquestioning emotional support that Sarah no longer provided. Sarah, consumed by jealousy, launched a vicious campaign against Abigail, accusing her of turning the queen against her. This only drove Anne further away. The shift in the queen's friendships had huge consequences. With Abigail's influence, Anne felt confident enough to defy Sarah and the Whigs. She began to dismiss Whig ministers and bring in Tories. In 1710, she dismissed the government, and the Duke of Marlborough was eventually removed from command. The change in government led to the end of the War of the Spanish Succession, with Britain signing a separate peace treaty that infuriated its former allies. A personal, emotional drama between three women had changed the course of European history. The public saw a sickly, indecisive queen. The private Anne was a woman whose reign was dominated by her passionate and ultimately heartbreaking personal relationships. She was not boring. Her emotional life was the central drama of her court. She was not weak. She ultimately asserted her own will and broke free from the most powerful woman in the country. Her story is a powerful example of how the personal and the political are always intertwined. Number 4 was the People's King, a Lonely Woman. Jadwiga of Poland, who reigned in the late 14th century, is one of the most revered figures in Polish history. Her public image is that of a saintly queen, a king in her own right. She was crowned Rex Poloniae, King of Poland, not Regina Queen, to signify that she was a monarch with her own power, not just a consort. She is remembered for her deep piety, her charity, her wisdom, and her personal sacrifice for the good of her nation. Legends tell of her miraculously leaving a footprint in a stone when she gave a jewel to a poor stonemason. She founded colleges, sponsored hospitals, and was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church in 1997. She is the perfect, selfless, holy queen. But behind this saintly image is the tragic story of a young girl forced to make an almost unbearable sacrifice. The private Jadwiga was a child who had her personal happiness completely subordinated to the needs of the state. She was a pawn in a huge geopolitical game, and she played her part with a grace that masked a likely broken heart. Jadwiga became King of Poland in 1384 at the age of 10. She had grown up in the sophisticated courts of Hungary and Vienna, and was betrothed from a young age to William of Habsburg, a handsome Austrian duke. By all accounts, it was a genuine childhood romance. They expected to marry and live a cultured life together. But the Polish nobles had other plans. Like, they saw a strategic opportunity to neutralize the threat from their powerful neighbor, the pagan Grand Duchy of Lithuania. They proposed that Jadwiga break her engagement to William and instead marry Jogaila, the Grand Duke of Lithuania. Jogaila was in his 30s, considered a barbarian by the standards of Christian Europe, and had never been baptized. But the political prize was immense. By marrying Jadwiga, Jogaila would convert to Catholicism, bringing all of Lithuania with him, and the two nations would be united in a powerful bloc against their common enemy, the Teutonic Knights. For the Polish lords, it was a brilliant solution. For the young Jadwiga, who was around 12 at the time, it was a catastrophe. She was being asked to give up the boy she loved for a man she had never met, from a land she considered uncivilized. There are historical accounts, though perhaps romanticized, of her despair. When her childhood fiancé William arrived in Krakow to claim his bride, she was desperate to be with him. One story claims that she was so determined to escape to him that she seized an axe to chop down the gates of Wall Castle before being persuaded to stop by a wise courtier. In the end, she made the choice that her public image is built upon. She sacrificed her personal feelings for the good of her kingdom and her faith. She agreed to marry Jogaila. This single act defined her reign and shaped the future of Central Europe for centuries. The Polish-Lithuanian Union became one of the most powerful states in Europe. As queen, she seems to have dedicated herself fully to her role. She was an active ruler, not just a figurehead. She was a skilled diplomat mediating disputes between her husband, now known as Ladislaw II Jagiello, and the Teutonic Knights. She used her personal wealth to restore and found the University of Krakow, which became a major center of learning. Her piety was genuine. She spent long hours in prayer and was known for her acts of charity. But we can only imagine the private cost of her public sacrifice. She was married to a man who was her political partner, but with whom she had little in common culturally. She had only one child, a daughter, who died shortly after birth, and Jadwiga herself died from complications a few weeks later, at the age of only 25. The public image is of a willing saint who chose her duty with a glad heart. The private reality was almost certainly that of a young woman forced into an agonizing choice, who then bore her burden with incredible dignity and resolve. Her sainthood is a testament to her public actions, but it also obscures the very human tragedy of the girl who had to give up her own life to become a king. Number 3 was the mother of Europe, a scheming power broker. Eleanor of Aquitaine had a long and incredible life, even by the standards of the tumultuous 12th century. Her public image shifted dramatically over her 82 years. In her youth as Duchess of Aquitaine and Queen of France, she was a symbol of courtly love and culture, a patron of poets and troubadours. She was seen as a beautiful, vivacious, and perhaps dangerously independent woman. Later, as Queen of England, wife of Henry II, she was cast in the role of a jealous, scheming wife, and later as a political prisoner. Finally, in her old age as Queen Dowager, she became the revered and powerful matriarch, the grandmother of Europe, who governed England in her son Richard the Lionheart's absence and secured the throne for her youngest son, John. But through all these shifting public roles, one thing remained constant. The private Eleanor was one of the most astute, ambitious, and ruthless political players of her age. The image of a patron of the arts or a troublesome wife is a pale reflection of a woman who was a ruler in her own right, who commanded armies, and who treated kingdoms like chess pieces in a game to secure power for herself and her children. She was not born to be a consort, she was born to rule. At 15, she inherited the vast and wealthy Duchy of Aquitaine, a territory in southwestern France that was larger and richer than the personal lands of the French king she was about to marry, Louis VII. She was his vassal, but she was also a far more powerful and worldly figure than him. Her court in Aquitaine was a center of culture and sophistication, while his in Paris was austere and pious. Their marriage was a clash of personalities. She famously complained that she had married a monk, not a king. She even accompanied him on the Second Crusade, bringing her own retinue of ladies and wagons of supplies, much to the scandal of more sober chroniclers. After their marriage was annulled, she made an even more spectacular move. Within 8 weeks, she married the young Henry of Anjou, who soon became King Henry II of England. This was a political earthquake. By uniting her lands in Aquitaine with his territories in Anjou and Normandy and his Kingdom of England, they created the Angevin Empire, a vast collection of lands that dwarfed the Kingdom of France. This was a love match, at least initially, but it was also a naked power play by Eleanor. For years, she and Henry were a power couple, but their relationship soured. Henry was a brilliant but autocratic ruler, and he was notoriously unfaithful. Eleanor was not a woman to be sidelined. The private Eleanor was not a passive, wronged wife. She was a political rival. She established her own court in Poitiers and encouraged her sons Henry the Young King, Richard, and Geoffrey to rebel against their father in 1173. The rebellion failed, and Eleanor paid the price. Henry had her imprisoned for the next 16 years. This was not a domestic dispute, it was a political coup attempt and its aftermath. When Henry II died and her favorite son, Richard the Lionheart, became king, the 67-year-old Eleanor was released and entered the most powerful phase of her life. While Richard was off on the Third Crusade and later held captive in Germany, she effectively ruled England as his regent. She was not just a figurehead. She raised his enormous ransom, quashed a rebellion by her youngest son, John, and managed the kingdom with skill and authority. She was a politician in her prime, in her late 60s and 70s. The public image of Eleanor is fragmented: the cultural patron, the scandalous queen, the rebellious wife, the dowager stateswoman. But the private reality is that she was always a ruler. She was a woman who was born to a great inheritance and spent her entire life fighting to control it, expand it, and pass it on to her sons. Her passions were not just for poetry or for men. Her greatest passion was for power. Number 2 was the God King, a woman in disguise. Hatshepsut, a pharaoh of Egypt's 18th dynasty, ruled for over 2 decades in the 15th century BCE. For much of history, she was largely unknown. Her public image, as it was reconstructed by early Egyptologists, was that of a usurper, an unnaturally ambitious woman who stole the throne from her young stepson, Thutmose III. The evidence seemed to back this up after her death. Her name and image were systematically erased from monuments and king lists, a clear attempt to wipe her from history. She was seen as an aberration, a woman who broke the sacred rules of kingship, but modern scholarship has revealed a completely different story. The private Hatshepsut was not a simple usurper, but a master politician and propagandist who carefully and brilliantly navigated the complex rules of Egyptian ideology to claim power. Her public image during her own reign was not that of a woman at all. It was the image of a traditional male pharaoh. Hatshepsut was the daughter of one pharaoh, Thutmose, and the wife of another, her half-brother Thutmose II. When her husband died, the heir was his young son Thutmose III, born to a lesser wife. Hatshepsut, as the boy king's aunt and stepmother, became his regent. This was a conventional role for a royal woman, but after a few years she did something unprecedented. She had herself crowned pharaoh, a role reserved exclusively for men. This was not a brutal power grab. It was a carefully managed political transformation. She didn't get rid of her stepson. She made him her co-ruler, though she was clearly the senior partner. She needed to justify this radical break with tradition. So she launched one of the most sophisticated public relations campaigns in ancient history. She used religion and imagery to build her case. On the walls of her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, she had a story carved in stone. It was the story of her divine birth. The carvings depict the god Amun-Ra taking the form of her father, Thutmose I, to visit her mother. Amun-Ra then declares that Hatshepsut will be the ruler of Egypt. This was not just a story, it was a theological argument. It claimed that her rule was not her own idea, but the will of the most powerful god. She was not a usurper, she was fulfilling her divine destiny. Her public image was also carefully constructed. In her early statues and reliefs, she is depicted as a woman. But over time, her image changes. She began to be shown with the full regalia of a male pharaoh, the kilt, the bare chest, and the false beard of kingship. This was not because she was trying to deceive people into thinking she was a man in her daily life. It was because the office of pharaoh was, by definition, a male role. To be a legitimate pharaoh, she had to be depicted as one. She was fitting herself into the established iconography of power. The private person was a woman, but the public office was male. Her reign was not a period of turmoil, as the usurper narrative would suggest. It was one of peace and great prosperity. She launched major building projects, including her stunning temple. She restored trade routes, most famously sending a major expedition to the land of Punt, likely modern-day Eritrea or Somalia, which brought back immense wealth, including live incense trees. She was an effective and successful ruler, so why was she erased? The likely answer is that after her death, When her stepson Thutmose III finally ruled alone, her reign posed an ideological problem. A successful female pharaoh challenged the traditional male-dominated order Mot. It was probably not an act of personal hatred from Thutmose III, who had served as the head of her armies for years. It was a move by a later pharaoh to restore the traditional image of kingship, to smooth over the historical wrinkle that a woman had so successfully held the ultimate power. The image of the ambitious usurper was a later invention. The reality was a brilliant political strategist who redefined what it meant to be a pharaoh. Number 1 was the Stoic Queen, a secret wit. Queen Elizabeth II had the longest reign of any British monarch. For over 70 years, her public image was one of unwavering duty, stability, and stoicism. She was the constant, the fixed point in a rapidly changing world. Her public persona was defined by what she didn't do, she didn't complain, she didn't explain, she didn't show emotion. Her face on the coins and stamps was serene and serious. Her annual Christmas messages were formal and reassuring. Her public appearances were managed with clockwork precision. She was the embodiment of the stiff upper lip, a queen who was more of a national symbol than a person. Even her colorful outfits were a kind of uniform designed to make her easily visible in a crowd. The public knew the monarch, but they knew almost nothing of the woman. But behind this wall of royal protocol and dignified reserve was a woman with a sharp, dry sense of humor, a talent for mimicry, and a deep, down-to-earth pragmatism. The private Elizabeth was, by all accounts from those who knew her best, incredibly funny. Her stoicism was a professional requirement, not her entire personality. Her wit was often subtle and deadpan. When a tourist who didn't recognize her near her Balmoral estate in Scotland asked if she had ever met the Queen, she reportedly replied, "No, I haven't." But he has, pointing to her protection officer. On another occasion, when asked by the American ambassador why she carried her signature handbag everywhere, even around the palace, she quipped that it was very useful for hitting people with. After her coronation in 1953, a long and exhausting ceremony, she is said to have used the imperial state crown to press a sore spot on her head, remarking to a lady in waiting that it was heavy. She was also a gifted mimic. In private, she could do wickedly accurate impressions of politicians, world leaders, and other public figures she had met over the years. This was a side of her that the public never saw, a playful, observant nature hidden behind the formal facade. It was her way of coping with the often tedious and repetitive nature of her duties. Her private life was grounded in simple pleasures. She was most herself at her country estates, Balmoral in Scotland and Sandringham in Norfolk. There, she could shed the formalities of monarchy. She loved horses and dogs, particularly her famous corgis. She was an expert equestrian and a knowledgeable breeder of racehorses. She was said to be at her happiest in a headscarf and Wellington boots, walking her dogs in the rain. This was the countrywoman, a world away from the diamond-encrusted figurehead of state occasions. Her relationship with her family was the core of her private life. While her public face was impassive, she was a wife, a mother, a grandmother, and a great-grandmother. Her marriage to Prince Philip was a partnership of over 70 years. He was the one person who could treat her as a normal human being. He was famously blunt and irreverent, and his humor and support were the bedrock of her long reign. So why the stark difference between the public and private queen? It was a deliberate choice, a strategy for a successful reign in the modern media age. She understood that for the monarchy to survive, it had to be seen as being above politics and above personal drama. By keeping her own personality and opinions private, she made herself a blank slate onto which the nation could project its own sense of identity and continuity. The public image of the stoic, dutiful queen was the most important role she ever played. It required her to suppress her natural humor and warmth in public. The flashes of wit that occasionally slipped out were a rare glimpse of the real woman behind the crown, a woman who took her job with the utmost seriousness, but who never took herself too seriously.